October 25, 1944. 6:58 a.m. 20 miles off the coast of Samar, Philippine Sea. The dawn was soft, almost gentle. The kind of tropical sunrise that turned the Pacific into hammered copper, where the division between sea and sky blurred into gradations of amber and pale blue. The water was calm, unnaturally so, the surface disturbed only by the wakes of 6 small escort carriers and their screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Aboard the USS White Plains, radar operator Seaman First Class David Brenner watched his scope with the half-attention of a man on his 4th hour of watch, expecting nothing more interesting than rain squalls or friendly aircraft returning from patrol. At 6:47 a.m., his scope had been empty except for known contacts. At 6:58, it exploded with returns, massive contacts, multiple contacts, moving at high speed from the northwest. He keyed the intercom, his voice steady despite what he was seeing. Bridge radar. Multiple large surface contacts bearing 320, range 30,000 yards, speed approximately 30 knots. Configuration suggests heavy surface units. There was a pause. Then the captain's voice, tight with the realization that the nightmare scenario was unfolding. Classification. Brenner studied the returns, counted them, recounted them because the number seemed impossible. Sir, I'm showing at least 18 major combatants. This is a fleet. The battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, represented the convergence of strategic desperation, tactical surprise, and material disparity at their most extreme. The Japanese combined fleet, attempting to disrupt the American invasion of Leyte Gulf, had divided into 3 forces designed to converge on the landing areas and destroy the vulnerable amphibious shipping that sustained the Philippine campaign. One of these forces, Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, consisted of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was the most powerful surface action group the Imperial Navy had assembled since Midway, and it had somehow penetrated American defensive screens during the night, bypassing the main battle fleet, emerging at dawn off Samar to find not the empty ocean they expected after their successful night transit, but a group of 6 escort carriers, small, slow, thin-skinned vessels designed to provide air support for ground operations, not fight surface engagements against battleships. The escort carriers of Task Unit April 3, 77, call sign Taffy 3, represented American naval aviation at its most improvised. These were not the fleet carriers that had won Midway and the Philippine Sea. These were converted merchant hulls, slower than destroyers, armed with a single 5-inch gun mount for self-defense, carrying aircraft designed to support ground troops rather than fight ship-to-ship engagements. Their escort screen consisted of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, vessels designed to hunt submarines, not duel with battleships. By every measure of naval power, this was not a combat force. It was a support element, positioned off Samar because no one expected Japanese heavy units to reach this area, because the main battle fleet under Admiral Halsey was chasing a decoy carrier force 300 miles north, because intelligence had assessed Center Force as too damaged from previous attacks to pose a threat. Every assumption had been wrong. Now 18 Japanese warships were closing at 30 knots, and between them and the vulnerable invasion shipping stood 6 escort carriers with a combined armament that wouldn't scratch a battleship's armor. The Japanese sailors steaming toward Taffy 3 that morning expected to encounter transport shipping, unarmed or lightly armed vessels crowded with troops and supplies, the kind of targets that battleship guns could destroy with impunity. They expected the culminating victory that had eluded the Imperial Navy since 1942, the decisive surface action where Japanese superiority in night fighting and gunnery could overwhelm American forces caught unprepared. They expected to vindicate the strategic concept behind the entire Leyte operation, to prove that aggressive employment of combined fleet assets could still change the course of the war. Vice Admiral Kurita, commanding from the heavy cruiser Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, mounting 9 18.1-inch guns that could fire shells weighing 3,200 pounds to a range of 25 miles, had ordered his force to charge southeast at maximum speed, to close with the American carriers and destroy them before they could launch aircraft or call for reinforcement. Standard doctrine. Overwhelming force applied rapidly against vulnerable targets. The formula had worked at Pearl Harbor, at Java Sea, at Savo Island. Should work now. What they encountered instead was something that violated every principle of naval warfare they understood. the escort carriers and their screen turned toward the attacking force and began fighting. At 7:01 a.m., the destroyer USS Johnston commenced firing her 5 5-inch guns at Japanese heavy units that outweighed her by a factor of 10. At 7:03, the escort carriers began launching aircraft, not orderly strikes with proper weapons loads, but everything that could fly, armed with whatever ordnance was available, depth charges and rockets designed for ground support because the carriers hadn't loaded armor-piercing bombs for a surface engagement no one anticipated. At 7:05, the destroyer escorts joined the action, their smaller guns adding to a volume of fire that couldn't possibly damage battleship armor but forced Japanese gunners to track multiple targets. By 7:08, Taffy 3 was generating smoke. Massive clouds of chemical smoke mixed with funnel exhaust, creating a visual barrier that disrupted Japanese gunnery and concealed the carrier's movements. And at 7:12, the destroyers Johnston, Hull, and Heermann began a torpedo attack against the Japanese battle line. The sound that defined this moment, the acoustic signature that would come to symbolize American naval doctrine in its purest form, was the 5-inch gun firing in rapid, sustained sequence. Each destroyer mounted 5 to 7 5-inch/38 caliber dual-purpose guns capable of firing 15 to 20 rounds per minute. In manual control mode, with trained crews, these weapons could achieve cyclic rates approaching their mechanical maximum. The sound was distinctive, sharper than battleship guns, faster than heavy cruiser fire, creating a rhythmic percussion that suggested desperation and defiance in equal measure. It was the sound of destroyer crews firing at targets they couldn't hurt, maintaining fire because doctrine said you fought until you couldn't fight, because stopping meant dying passive rather than active, because the carriers behind them needed every second the destroyers could buy. The Johnston's commanding officer, Commander Ernest Evans, had turned his destroyer toward the Japanese fleet without orders, without coordination, operating on the fundamental naval principle that you attack threats to the formation you're screening regardless of odds. The Johnston displaced 2,100 tons. The battleship Yamato, now firing her 18.1-inch main battery at the American carriers, displaced 72,000 tons. The shells fired by Yamato's main guns weighed more than Johnston's entire torpedo load. This was not a fight. This was suicide. Evans pressed his attack anyway, closing to 9,000 yards before launching a full spread of 10 torpedoes, then continuing to engage with gunfire while his ship maneuvered through splashes from Japanese heavy guns that threw columns of water higher than Johnston's mast. One torpedo struck the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow and forcing her out of the battle. Johnston took 3 14-inch hits from a battleship and multiple 8-inch hits from cruisers, lost power to her aft gun mounts, had her bridge shattered by near misses, and continued fighting. Historical records from the Naval Historical Center document that the 3-destroyer torpedo attack executed between 7:12 and 7:20 a.m. forced the Japanese battle line to maneuver defensively, turning away from the torpedo spreads and losing cohesion as individual captains made independent evasive decisions. This 8-minute period, during which American destroyers pressed attacks that should have resulted in their immediate destruction, bought time for the escort carriers to open range and launch additional aircraft. The tactical calculus was brutal and explicit. Trade destroyers for time. Sacrifice small units to preserve larger ones. Accept certain losses to create possible survival. Every Navy captain understood this equation. Few had to execute it while under fire from battleships. The Japanese gunners tracking American destroyers through their optical rangefinders experienced something unprecedented in their service. Targets that refused to die despite taking hits that should have been catastrophic, that continued firing despite visible damage, that pressed attacks into point-blank range where destroyer guns could actually penetrate cruiser armor. The psychological impact was profound. Japanese doctrine emphasized offensive spirit and aggressive tactics, but it assumed that spirit would be opposed by enemy forces demonstrating similar values. Courage meeting courage, aggression meeting aggression. What they faced off Samar was something different. American ships fighting with what appeared to be suicidal determination but was actually cold calculation. The destroyers weren't sacrificing themselves for honor. They were trading their lives for time because the tactical math said this was the only way to save the carriers. The distinction mattered. Honor could be respected. Mathematics were simply confusing. By 7:15 a.m., the escort carriers were making smoke while running southeast at their maximum speed of 17 knots. Painfully slow by naval combat standards, slower than the Japanese heavy units pursuing them by nearly 15 knots, but fast enough that, with the destroyers buying time and aircraft harassing the Japanese formation, range wasn't closing as rapidly as it should. The carriers were also firing back. Each mounted a single 5-inch/38 gun aft, typically used for anti-aircraft defense but capable of surface fire. These single guns, operated by crews who had never trained for surface combat, began engaging Japanese heavy cruisers at ranges beyond 15,000 yards. Extreme range for 5-inch guns, but effective enough to cause splashes that disrupted Japanese optical range-finding and forced periodic course changes. The symbolic object that emerged from this engagement, mentioned repeatedly in after-action reports and survivor accounts, was the 5-inch shell casing. Specifically, the volume of them. The escort carrier White Plains fired 414 rounds from her single 5-inch gun during the engagement. The destroyer Johnston fired more than 800 rounds before her guns were silenced by battle damage. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, a vessel displacing only 1,350 tons, designed to escort convoys and hunt submarines, fired 608 rounds of 5-inch ammunition in a surface engagement against heavy cruisers, firing so rapidly that the gun crew ignored safety procedures about barrel cooling, firing until the barrel glowed red, firing until the breech mechanism began to fail from heat stress, firing until the magazine was nearly empty. Each shell casing represented American industrial capacity translated into tactical persistence. Each round fired was proof that American logistics could supply even the smallest warship with enough ammunition to fight beyond its designed capacity. Japanese reports from survivors of the action described the American fire as unusually heavy and persistent beyond expectation. Heavy cruiser Chikuma, engaging the destroyer Hirman, reported receiving more than 40 hits from what were assessed as 5-inch shells. Too small to penetrate heavy armor but sufficient to damage superstructure, disable fire control equipment, and cause casualties among exposed personnel. The cumulative effect of hundreds of 5-inch shells impacting across the Japanese formation wasn't decisive in terms of sinking ships, but it was tactically significant in terms of disrupting coordination, forcing defensive maneuvering, and creating the impression that the American force was larger and more capable than its actual composition. The Japanese expected to encounter unarmed transports. They found themselves dodging torpedoes and taking gunfire from what seemed like an entire task group rather than a handful of escorts. At 7:35 a.m., aircraft from the escort carriers began their attacks. These were not the coordinated strikes that fleet carriers executed with torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter escort. These were improvised attacks by aircraft armed with whatever ordnance had been loaded for ground support missions. Depth charges designed to kill submarines, rockets designed to destroy bunkers, machine gun ammunition, and in some cases nothing but the aircraft itself used as a psychological weapon by pilots making dry runs to distract Japanese gunners. The Avenger torpedo bombers had no torpedoes. The Wildcat fighters had no armor-piercing bombs. What they had was fuel enough for multiple attack runs and pilots willing to press those runs to altitudes where Japanese anti-aircraft fire was most effective. The transformation in Japanese tactical assessment during this engagement was documented in radio traffic intercepted by American Signals Intelligence and in post-war interviews with surviving officers. At 7 a.m., Center Force believed it was engaging a fleet carrier task group, the massed aircraft launches and heavy volume of fire-suggested fleet units rather than escort carriers. At 7:30, after sustaining damage and observing the American forces composition more carefully, Center Force assessed it was fighting a fleet carrier task group supported by heavy cruisers. The 5-inch gunfire was being misidentified as 8-inch cruiser fire because the volume suggested heavier weapons. Not until after 8 a.m. did Japanese commanders realize they were fighting escort carriers and destroyers. The confusion was tactically significant. Vice Admiral Kurita made deployment decisions based on the assumption he was facing a major American force rather than a screening unit. He held back his battleships for protection against torpedo attacks he assumed must be coming from fleet destroyers. He ordered dispersed rather than concentrated attacks to avoid presenting a mass target to carriers he believed capable of launching heavy strikes. The American force's aggressive defense created the illusion of capability far exceeding its actual strength. By 8 a.m., the tactical situation was deteriorating for Taffy 3 despite the effective defense. The destroyer hull was sinking, having taken 40 hits from battleship and cruiser fire while covering the carrier's withdrawal. The Johnston was dead in the water, her engine rooms flooded, still firing her remaining forward guns at Japanese heavy units passing within 6,000 yards. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts had taken 3 14-inch hits that broke her keel and was beginning to sink. The escort carrier Gambier Bay was taking repeated hits from Japanese cruiser fire and would sink at 8:07. The Japanese force, though disrupted and damaged, still had overwhelming firepower advantage. If they pressed the attack with coordinated concentration, they would destroy the remaining carriers within 30 minutes. At 8:20 a.m., Admiral Kurita ordered Center Force to break off the attack and withdraw north. The decision has been debated by naval historians for 80 years. Kurita's force had lost 3 heavy cruisers, Kumano to torpedo damage, Suzuya to air attack, Chikuma to combined destroyer and aircraft damage, but still possessed 4 battleships and multiple cruisers against American forces that were visibly damaged and low on ammunition. From a pure force ratio perspective, pressing the attack should have resulted in complete destruction of Taffy 3 and left Center Force free to proceed south to attack the invasion shipping. Instead, Kurita withdrew. The official Japanese explanation, provided in post-war interrogations, cited concern about American reinforcements, confusion about the size of the force being engaged, and uncertainty about the location of American fleet carriers. The explanation is rational and defensible. It's also evidence of how completely the aggressive American defense had disrupted Japanese situational awareness. They had fought escort carriers and destroyers for 90 minutes and concluded they were facing a major fleet action that required withdrawal rather than persistence. The emotional and psychological experience of the American sailors who survived this engagement was documented in oral history interviews conducted decades later. Gunner's Mate Second Class Robert Hagen, who served aboard White Plains, described the moment when Japanese shells began landing around his carrier. "We knew we were dead. Battleships don't miss at that range. They were shooting at us with guns bigger than anything on our ship, and we had 1 5-inch popgun to shoot back with. But the gun captain said load and fire, so we loaded and fired. We fired until my hands were bleeding from handling hot shell casings. We fired until I couldn't hear anything but ringing. We fired because stopping meant accepting that we were already dead. And none of us were ready to accept that." The testimony captures the fundamental psychology of the American defense. Not heroic sacrifice for abstract principles, but practical refusal to surrender while means of resistance remained available. The recurring symbolism of the 5-inch shell casing, that brass cylinder ejected thousands of times across the engagement, represented more than firepower. It represented the industrial base that produced ammunition in sufficient quantity that even the smallest escort carrier could fire more than 400 rounds in a single engagement. It represented logistics chains that ensured those shells were loaded aboard ship, stored properly, maintained in tropical conditions, and available when needed despite the improvised nature of the battle. It represented an economic system that could produce enough ammunition to supply hundreds of ships simultaneously while maintaining civilian production, feeding allies through Lend-Lease, and building new ships faster than losses could deplete the fleet. Each shell casing was a small piece of evidence for a larger strategic truth. America's industrial capacity was sufficient to maintain combat operations at levels that seemed wasteful by Axis standards, but were actually sustainable. The battle off Samar cost Taffy 3 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and more than 1,000 casualties. Center Force withdrew with 3 heavy cruisers sunk or disabled and multiple units damaged. The kill ratio favored the Japanese. The strategic outcome favored the Americans. Center Force never reached the invasion shipping. The Leyte landings continued uninterrupted. The Japanese combined fleet committed its available surface forces to the battle and achieved no strategic objective. The invasion they were attempting to disrupt succeeded, and the naval forces they hoped to destroy remained operational. The tactical defeat, measured in ships sunk and casualties sustained, was also a strategic victory because the inferior force had delayed the superior force long enough that the superior force chose withdrawal over persistence. The 5-inch gun mounts that had fired thousands of rounds during the engagement were inspected after the battle by Navy ordnance specialists. Multiple guns showed heat stress beyond designed operational limits. Barrels were worn, breech mechanisms were damaged, recoil systems had failed. The guns had been operated beyond their designed capacity, beyond safety margins, beyond manufacturer specifications. they had also worked. They had maintained fire throughout the engagement despite misuse and overstress. This was characteristic of American naval equipment in World War II, designed with sufficient over-engineering that even when operated beyond limits, the equipment continued functioning long enough to matter tactically. German and Japanese equivalents were often more precisely engineered, more efficient at design capacity, but less tolerant of abuse. American equipment was designed for sailors who would push it beyond limits, and it was built to survive that treatment. Commander Ernest Evans did not survive the sinking of Johnston. He was last seen on the bridge of his sinking destroyer, having given orders to abandon ship, refusing to leave until all survivors were clear. His body was never recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the citation reading in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepid valor above and beyond the call of duty. The language is formal, bureaucratic, drained of the specific horror of commanding a destroyer through 90 minutes of close-range combat against battleships. Evans had turned his ship toward overwhelming enemy forces without orders, pressed a torpedo attack to point-blank range, continued fighting after sustaining damage that should have been mission-killing, and bought time with his ship and crew that allowed the carriers to survive. The tactical math was cold. One destroyer traded for carrier survival. The human reality was more complex. 186 men died aboard Johnston, trading their lives for a probability of survival for several thousand other sailors on the carriers. The transformation in American naval doctrine following Samar was subtle but significant. Pre-war doctrine had emphasized fleet actions between battleships, with carriers providing supporting air power and destroyers screening against torpedo attack. By 1944, carriers had become the primary striking arm, but they were still conceived as units requiring protection by heavier ships. Samar demonstrated that properly employed, even escort carriers could survive surface action against overwhelming force if their screen fought aggressively and their air power could be brought to bear. Post-war carrier doctrine incorporated these lessons. Aggressive defense by escort units, immediate airstrikes with whatever ordnance was available, sustained fire even from weapons too light to decisively damage heavy targets. The doctrine wasn't claiming that destroyers could defeat battleships. The loss ratio at Samar proved they couldn't. The doctrine was asserting that destroyers could delay battleships long enough for other advantages to become decisive. Japanese naval doctrine never fully adapted to the lessons of Samar. The institutional assessment was that center force had encountered unexpectedly heavy resistance and made a prudent withdrawal given tactical uncertainty. The deeper lesson that American forces would fight aggressively even in hopeless tactical situations, that material advantages allowed sustained combat beyond what Japanese logistics could support, that American industrial capacity translated into tactical persistence. This lesson was understood intellectually but couldn't be operationalized. Understanding that the enemy has unlimited ammunition doesn't help if you don't have unlimited ammunition yourself. Recognizing that American doctrine emphasizes sustained fire doesn't provide solutions when your own doctrine emphasizes ammunition conservation because resupply is uncertain. The Japanese Navy understood its disadvantages clearly by late 1944. Understanding didn't provide solutions. By 9 a.m. on October 25th, the battle off Samar was effectively over. Center force was withdrawing north, harassed by airstrikes but no longer engaged with surface units. Taffy 3 was regrouping, conducting damage assessments, recovering survivors from sinking ships. The escort carrier White Plains, which had fired 414 rounds from her single 5-inch gun, was left with 57 rounds in her magazine, sufficient for approximately 3 more minutes of sustained fire. The destroyer Heermann, which had expended all torpedoes and most of her 5-inch ammunition, had 13 shells remaining. The ammunition expenditure across Taffy 3 during the 90-minute engagement totaled more than 5,000 5-inch rounds, an average of more than 50 rounds per minute sustained from ships that were simultaneously maneuvering, making smoke, and coordinating air operations. The ammunition expenditure was by Japanese standards profligate, by American standards acceptable. The 5-inch shell casings that littered the decks of American ships after the engagement were swept overboard during cleanup operations, dumped into the Pacific where they sank to depths that would preserve them for millennia. Each casing had served its purpose, contained the propellant that launched a shell, been ejected from the breach, been kicked aside by crew loading the next round. Now they were debris to be cleared so the ships could return to operational status. No one thought to preserve them as historical artifacts. They were industrial products, manufactured by the millions, distinguished only by the circumstances of their use rather than any intrinsic quality. This was American material culture in its purest form. Objects produced in such quantity that individual items had no special value, that waste was acceptable because more could always be produced. The survivors of Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, and Gamber Bay spent hours in the water before rescue, some supporting wounded shipmates, some dealing with shark attacks, all dealing with the specific horror of floating in open ocean while petroleum fires from sinking ships drifted nearby. Rescue operations recovered approximately 1,150 survivors from the 4 sunk ships. More than 1,000 sailors died in the engagement or during the time between sinking and rescue. The casualty rate among the screening ships, the destroyers and destroyer escorts that had engaged the Japanese battle line directly, exceeded 50%. These were not acceptable losses by any standard except the cold calculus that losing half your screen to save the carriers was a successful trade. The mathematics were sound. The human cost was immense. Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw at the moment when his force still held overwhelming advantage has been analyzed, criticized, and defended by historians examining the battle from every possible angle. The tactical situation at 8:20 a.m. showed center force with 4 battleships and multiple cruisers operational against American forces that had lost ships and were low on ammunition. Pressing the attack should have resulted in complete destruction of Taffy 3. But Kurita was operating with incomplete information, had been under continuous air attack for 3 days, had already lost 3 heavy cruisers that morning, and believed, based on the volume of fire and number of aircraft, that he was engaging a major American formation that might have reinforcements nearby. His decision to withdraw was rational given the information available to him. It was also exactly the decision that American aggressive defense was designed to produce. Make the enemy believe you're stronger than you are, create tactical uncertainty, generate psychological pressure to disengage. The strategic implications of Samar extended far beyond the immediate battle. Center forces' withdrawal meant the Leyte invasion proceeded without major naval interference. The Japanese combined fleet had committed its available heavy surface units and achieved no strategic objective. The Imperial Navy would never again sortie a major surface action group in offensive operations. The battle represented the end of the battleship era in a very specific way. Not because battleships couldn't fight, Yamato and her consorts had ample opportunity to destroy the escort carriers, but because they couldn't be committed in situations where their overwhelming force could be brought to bear before circumstances changed. Modern naval warfare had become too fluid, too dependent on air power and intelligence, for the slow development of battleship actions that pre-war doctrine assumed. By the time battleships closed to gunnery range, the tactical situation had already been decided by aircraft and destroyers. The 5-inch/38 caliber gun, that workhorse weapon that had armed American destroyers and provided secondary armament for larger ships, became the symbolic representation of American naval firepower in the Pacific War. Not the 16-inch rifles of battleships or the dive bombers of fleet carriers, but the medium-caliber dual-purpose gun that could fire 15 rounds per minute, that was mounted by the dozens on every major warship and by handfuls on the smallest escorts, that was produced in sufficient quantity that ammunition supply was never a limiting factor. The gun wasn't particularly powerful by naval standards. Its shells couldn't penetrate battleship armor, could barely damage heavy cruiser armor, were most effective against destroyers and light cruisers and aircraft. But the gun could be fired continuously, could engage multiple targets, could maintain pressure on enemy formations through sustained fire volume. It was the democratic weapon, not the most powerful, but the most persistent, reliable, and abundant. The sailors who survived Samar returned to combat operations after brief rest periods. The ships that survived were repaired and returned to service. The carrier White Plains participated in the Lingayen Gulf landings and later supported operations at Okinawa. The destroyer Hirman received battle damage repairs and continued escort operations through the end of the war. The crews who had fought a 90-minute surface action against overwhelming odds went back to the routine of convoy escort, air operations support, and anti-submarine patrol. The battle became one entry in their service records, distinguished from other engagements only by its exceptional circumstances. This was characteristic of American military culture in World War II. Extraordinary actions were documented, recognized, and then normalized as sailors and soldiers moved on to the next operation. There was always a next operation. The war continued until it was won. Japanese survivors of Center Force faced a different future. The 3 heavy cruisers lost or disabled at Samar represented approximately 10% of the Imperial Navy's heavy cruiser strength. Replacements were not available. Fuel oil to operate the remaining ships was becoming scarce as American submarines interdicted tanker traffic. Trained crews to replace casualties were in short supply as pilot and sailor training programs were shortened to meet immediate needs. The material attrition that Samar represented was part of a larger pattern. Japanese forces could still fight, could still inflict casualties, but could not sustain operations at the tempo required to contest American advances. Each engagement depleted resources that couldn't be replaced. Each loss was permanent. The mathematics of attrition warfare were working against Japan with mechanical inevitability. There's a memorial on Samar Island in the Philippines, erected decades after the war, commemorating the battle off Samar and the ships that fought there. The memorial lists the names of ships sunk and sailors killed. It doesn't capture the sound of 5-inch guns firing in rapid sequence, the smell of cordite and fuel oil, the specific feeling of standing on a destroyer deck while battleship shells land close enough that the splashes drench the crew. Memorials can't capture sensory details. They preserve names and dates and create space for remembering. The sailors who survived didn't need memorials to remember. They heard the 5-inch guns firing every time unexpected noise jolted them from sleep. They remembered the specific rhythm. Load, fire, eject, load, fire, eject, sustained for minutes that felt like hours, maintained until ammunition ran low or guns failed or the enemy finally withdrew. The truth that emerged from Samar, the lesson that American naval doctrine would carry forward through the remainder of World War II and into future conflicts, was both simple and profound. Aggressive action by inferior forces can create tactical effects disproportionate to their strength if sustained long enough. The escort carriers and destroyers off Samar were outgunned, outweighed, and should have been destroyed within 30 minutes of initial contact. They survived for 90 minutes and inflicted sufficient damage that the enemy withdrew. The survival wasn't miraculous. It was the result of aggressive tactics, sustained fire, coordinated airstrikes, and material advantages that allowed American ships to keep fighting after sustaining damage that would have disabled Japanese equivalents. The tactics were doctrine. The sustainability was industrial capacity. Together, they translated an impossible tactical situation into a strategic victory. October 25, 1944, began with sunrise over calm seas and ended with survivors floating in oil-slicked water, with ships sinking beneath waves, with thousands of shell casings scattered across decks and tumbling through water toward abyssal depths where they would rest undisturbed for centuries. Between dawn and noon, 18 Japanese warships had engaged 6 American escort carriers and their screen, expecting to destroy a vulnerable target and achieving instead a tactical stalemate that became strategic defeat. The escort carriers that were supposed to die had survived. The invasion shipping they protected remained untouched. And the Japanese combined fleet, having committed its heavy surface units to battle and achieved no objective, withdrew to ports where fuel oil shortages and air attack would gradually reduce it to immobility. The 5-inch shell casings that symbolized the engagement, those thousands of brass cylinders ejected during 90 minutes of sustained fire, represented the industrial democracy that produced them in sufficient quantity that even the smallest escort could fight beyond designed capacity. Each casing was evidence of factories in Pennsylvania and Connecticut, of logistics chains across the Pacific, of an economic system that could produce enough to be wasteful in combat. The waste was strategic. The abundance was decisive. And the sound of 5-inch guns firing in rapid sequence became the acoustic signature of American naval power. Not the most powerful weapons, but the most persistent, fired without concern for ammunition conservation because more would always arrive, fired until the enemy withdrew or the magazine ran empty, fired with the absolute confidence that industrial capacity could replace whatever was expended. The sailors who fought off Samar carried that sound for the rest of their lives. They heard it in unexpected moments, when metal clanged, when machinery cycled, when anything created the rhythmic percussion that resembled gunfire. They heard it and remembered standing on destroyer decks while battleships fired at them, remembered loading shells until hands bled, remembered that for 90 minutes they had fought an impossible battle and survived because their ships kept shooting and their ammunition kept loading and their doctrine said fight until you can't fight even when the tactical situation says you've already lost. That was the American way of naval warfare in 1944. That was the sound of abundance applied to combat. That was the truth that 18 Japanese ships discovered when they ambushed one U.S. task group and received 14 minutes of answer before the 90-minute lesson in industrial democracy had fully concluded. American gunners had more shells than you had time, more persistence than you had patience, more industrial capacity than you had strategic options. The guns would keep firing. The casings would keep ejecting. The ammunition would keep loading. And somewhere in Connecticut, factories were already producing tomorrow's shells while today's casings tumbled through seawater toward seafloor, glinting brass monuments to abundance, democracy, and the specific mathematics of warfare where sustained fire defeats overwhelming force, where persistence defeats power, where 14 minutes of answer becomes 90 minutes of survival becomes strategic victory measured not in ships sunk, but in invasions that continued uninterrupted because one task group refused to die when death was tactically inevitable.